Hi everybody, I'm Esther. Welcome to this grammar video. In this video, I will introduce the present tense. It's a very important tense for learning English. In this video, I will introduce the present simple, the present continuous, the present perfect, and the present perfect continuous tense. There's a lot to learn, so keep watching. And let's get started. Hi everybody, my name is Esther. I'm so excited to teach you the present simple tense in today's video. Now this lesson can be a little difficult, so I'll do my best to keep it easy and fun for you. My goal is for you to understand how and when to use this grammar by the end of the video. Let's get started. Let's start with the first usage for the present simple tense. The first usage is pretty easy. We use it to talk about facts, truths, and generalizations. Let's look at some examples. The sun is bright. Now that's a fact. It doesn't change. Everybody knows that the sun is bright. It was bright yesterday, it's bright today, and it will be bright tomorrow. That makes it a fact. Pigs don't fly. That's also a fact. Everybody knows that pigs don't fly. Cats are better than dogs. Now this you may not agree with. This is my truth. I'm making a generalization about cats and dogs in this example. And finally, it's cold in winter. This really depends on where you live, but for a lot of people, or let's say for most people, it is cold in the winter. So that's the truth for some people. Now, let's look back and see what verb I used in the present simple tense. For the first sentence, we have is. I used the be verb is to talk about the sun. In the next sentence, I used the negative of do not. And you'll notice I used a contraction and put these two words together to make it don't. Cats are better than dogs. I use the be verb are to talk about cats because cats is plural. And finally, it's cold in winter. Here, I use the be verb is again, but I used a contraction to combine it and is and made its. Let's move on to the next usage. We also use the present simple tense to talk about habits and routines. So things and actions that happen regularly. Let's look at the examples. I always eat lunch at noon. You'll notice I use the adverb always because I'm talking about something that I do regularly. What is that? Eat lunch at noon. So I use the present simple tense. And here I use the verb eat. I eat. The second example says you play games every day. Do you see the clue that helps you know that this is something that happens regularly? It's every day. So it's something that happens as a routine or a habit. So you play games. The verb here is play. You play. The next example says Seth starts work at 9 a.m. daily. Again, this is something that happens regularly. Seth goes to work at 9 a.m. every day. Now you'll notice I put a blue line under the S in starts. Can you figure out why? Well, remember that when the subject of a sentence is he, she, or it, we need to add an S or ES to the end of the verb in the present simple tense. Seth is a he, so we need to add an S. Seth starts work at 9 a.m. daily. And the last example, they study English every Monday. Again, every Monday means that they do it regularly, and that's why we use the present simple tense. They study. So as a review, remember, we use the present simple tense to talk about habits and routines that happen regularly. Let's move on. We also use the present simple tense with non-continuous verbs. These are verbs that we don't use in the continuous form, even if they're happening right now. They're also called stated verbs. These are connected with thoughts, opinions, feelings, emotions, and our five senses. Let's look at the examples. I love my mom. The verb here is love. That's an emotion. So I use the present simple tense. It smells good. Smell is one of the 5 senses. So I use the present simple tense. You'll notice I underlined the S because remember, the subject is it. Kelly feels happy. This is talking about a feeling. Again, the subject here is Kelly, which is a she. So I added an S to the verb. And finally, they need help. We don't say they are needing help, even though it's happening right now. Need is non-continuous, so we say they need help. So remember, you also use the present simple tense with non-continuous verbs connected with thoughts, opinions, feelings, emotions, and our 5 senses. Let's move on. Speakers occasionally use the present simple tense to talk about something that will happen in the near future. Now, this can be a little confusing, but we're not using the future tense. We're using the present simple tense. It's possible to do that, and it's actually common for people to do that. Again, for something that will happen in the near future. Let's look at the examples. I have class at 6 p.m. 6 p.m., that's pretty soon. So I can say I have class, the present simple tense. Lisa arrives on Sunday. Again, the near future, Sunday. So I use the present simple tense. I added an S at the end of arrive because Lisa, the subject, is a she. We start work soon. Again, the near future, soon. So I use the present simple verb start. And finally, my students come tomorrow. This is something that will happen in the near future, so I use the verb come. So remember, it is possible and it is common to use the present simple tense to talk about something that will happen in the near future. Let's go to the next usage. Let's talk about a possible negative usage for the present simple tense, and that is do not and does not. The first example says Mike eats bread. I put an S at the end of eat because the subject is Mike, which is a he. Now that's not a negative statement. What happens when I want to turn it into a negative statement? Well, I change it like this. Mike doesn't eat bread. So you'll notice that I didn't move the S here, okay? Instead, I added doesn't. I took does and not, and I turned it into a contraction by combining the two and making it doesn't. So if the subject is he, she, or it, we use does not or doesn't to make it negative. You swim well. In this case, I don't need to put an S at the end of swim because the subject is you. If I want to make this sentence negative, I use don't. You don't swim well. I use the contraction for do and not. I combine them to make don't. So if the subject is I, you, we, or they, we use do not or don't. So to review, do not and does not or don't and doesn't is a possible usage for the negative for present simple tense. Let's continue on. Now I'll talk about one possible question form for the present simple tense, and that is by using do or does. So let's look at the example. They live here. That's not a question, right? They live here. In order to turn it into a question, it's really simple. All I have to do is add do to the beginning and add a question mark at the end. Do they live here? So if the subject is I, you, we, or they, simply add do to the beginning of the question. How about this one? He plays soccer. In this statement, the subject is he, and that's why you should know by now I have an S at the end of play. However, to turn this into a question, I add does at the beginning. Does he play soccer? What you'll notice here is that I no longer have the S at the end of play. Instead, I just use does at the beginning. So for he, she, or it, put does at the beginning and don't worry about putting an S or ES at the end of the verb. So to review, one possible way of forming a question for the present simple tense is using do or does at the beginning. All right, let's move on. Let's start with the first checkup. In this checkup, I want you to focus on the be verbs. Remember, be verbs in the present simple tense can be is, am, or are. Take a look at the first sentence. It says, she blank at school. The subject of this sentence is she. What be verb do we use for she? The correct answer is. Now, if you were thinking of the negative, the correct answer would be she isn't or she is not. That's correct as well. And if we want to use a contraction for she is, we can say she's at school. For the next one, it says they blank 20 years old. The subject of this sentence is they. What be verb do we use for they? The correct answer is are. For the negative, you can also use aren't or are not. Also, if you want to use the contraction for they are, you can say they're 20 years old. The next sentence says, his father blank busy. The subject of this sentence is his father. What subject pronoun do we use for his father? The correct answer is he. Remember, for he, she, it, the be verb is. For the negative, we can say isn't or is not. And for a contraction for father and is, we can say his father's busy. Now, I want you to try to find the mistakes in this sentence. We isn't good friends. Did you find the mistake? This is the mistake. The subject is we, and the be verb is are. Therefore, the correct answer is we are not, or the contraction we aren't good friends. The next sentence, can you find the mistake? Are John a teacher? Think about the subject of this sentence. The subject is John. And John, the subject pronoun, is he. Therefore, we don't use are, we use is. Is John a teacher? Is John a teacher? And finally, it am a puppy. This one is a big mistake. The subject here is it. What be verb do we use for it? The correct answer is. So we don't say it am a puppy, we say it is a puppy. Great job, guys. Let's move on to the next checkup. For the next checkup, I want you to think of some other verbs in the present simple tense. Take a look at the first sentence. He blank, I want you to think of the verb like, his dinner. What do we do to the verb when the subject is he, she, or it? Remember, we add an S. He likes his dinner. For the negative, you can also say he doesn't like his dinner. The next sentence says, my students blank, I want you to think of need, books. What is the subject pronoun for my students? The correct answer is they. If the subject is I, you, we, or they in the present simple tense, we don't change the verb. We keep it as is. So the correct answer is, my students need books. Now for the negative, you can say, my students don't need books. The next sentence says, I blank, think of the verb live, in London. What do we do here? Again, the subject is I. Therefore, we don't change the verb. The correct answer is I live in London. What's the negative? I don't live in London. For the next part, I would like for you to try to find the mistake in the sentence. He doesn't likes math. What's the error here? Well, this is a negative. He doesn't. That's correct. However, we do not add an S when we have doesn't in front of it. Do he eat candy? Here we have a question. The subject of this sentence is he. For he, she, it, when we're making a sentence in the present simple tense, we use does, not do. So the correct answer is, does he eat candy? And finally, Sam is play computer games. There are two present simple verbs here, and we can't have that. So the correct way to fix this sentence is to get rid of the is, so take that out, and say Sam plays computer games. Add an S because the subject is Sam, which is a he. Great job! Let's move on to the next practice. For this next practice, we're taking a look at routines. Remember, the present simple tense can be used to describe events that happen regularly. Let's take a look at the first sentence. We blank the bus every day, and I want you to use the verb take. Here we see the clue word every day, which shows that this is a routine. The subject of this sentence is we. In the present simple tense, remember, if the subject is I, you, we, or they, we do not change the verb. Therefore, the correct answer is we take the bus every day. In the second sentence, it says he blank to school every morning. Again, a routine. The subject here is he. What do we do if the subject is he, she, or it? We add S or ES to the verb. In this example, the verb is go. So we have to add ES. He goes to school every morning. In the next sentence, it says Lizzie not play, in parentheses, tennis. Here, I want you to think about the negative form. Lizzie is a she. The subject pronoun is she. So what do we do for the negative? We say does not, or the contraction doesn't play tennis. We do not add an S or ES to the end of the verb. Instead, we say doesn't or does not. Now, I want you to find the mistake in the next sentence. They watches TV at night. Can you figure out what's wrong with this sentence? The subject is they. Therefore, remember, we do not change the verb. We say watch. They watch TV at night. In the next sentence or question, it says, does he plays soccer every week? The subject of this sentence is he. To make a sentence, putting does at the beginning is okay. However, we don't put an S at the end of play. Therefore, the correct answer is to simply say, does he play soccer every week? And finally, he always forgets his book. In this case, the subject is he. Remember again, for he, she, it, we add S or ES to the end of the verb. What's the verb in the sentence? It's forget. Therefore, we have to say, he always forgets his book. Great job. Let's move on to the next practice. In this checkup, we'll take a look at how the present simple tense can be used to describe future events. Take a look at the first sentence. It says the airplane blank tonight, and we're looking at the verb leave. What is the subject of this sentence? The correct answer is airplane. What subject pronoun do we use for airplane? It's it. Remember, in the present simple tense for he, she, it, we add an S or ES to the verb. The verb here is leave, so we simply add an S. The correct answer is the airplane leaves tonight. In the second sentence, it says, does the movie blink soon? And we're using the verb start. What is the subject of this sentence? It's movie. And what subject pronoun do we use for movie? It's it. So it's like saying, does it blink soon? Well, this is a question. So we already have the correct word in the front, does. For he, she, it, when we're asking a question, we use does. Now, all we have to do is use the same verb in its base form. So, does the movie start soon? We do not add an S or ES here. Finally, it says, Vicky blink tomorrow. The subject of this sentence is Vicky. Vicky is a girl, so the subject pronoun is she. You'll remember now that in this case, we put works. W-O-R-K-S. Works. Vicky works tomorrow. Now, let's find the mistakes in the sentence below. He do leave at 3:30 p.m. Actually, there's only one mistake. Can you find it? He do leave at 3:30 p.m. We do not need the do here. We only use do in a question or in the negative form. But also the subject is he, so we would use does. Either way, we don't need this here. Well, now we have the verb leave with the subject he. Do you know what to do? We simply change this to leaves, just like we did in the first sentence. He leaves at 3:30 p.m. In the next sentence, they don't start school today. We have a negative sentence. They don't. That's correct. Do not is correct for subject pronoun they. However, in the negative form, we don't have to change the main verb at all. Therefore, all we will do is say they don't start school today. No S. Finally, does we eat at noon? Take a look. What is the subject or subject pronoun in this sentence? The correct answer is we. Think about the question form. Do we say do or does in the question form for the subject pronoun we? The correct answer is do. We say do. So the correct way to say this sentence or question is, do we eat at noon? Great job, guys. You're done with the practice. Thank you for your hard work. Let's move on. Good job, guys. You put in a lot of practice today. The present simple tense is not easy, and I'm really happy to see how hard you guys worked on mastering it. Be sure to check out my other videos, and thank you for watching this video. I'll see you next time. Bye! Hi everybody, I'm Esther. I'm so excited to be teaching you the present continuous tense in this video. This tense is used to describe an action that's happening right now, a longer action in progress, and something happening in the near future. There's a lot to learn, but don't worry, I'll guide you through it. Let's get started. The present continuous tense is used to talk about actions that are happening right now. For example, I'm teaching English, and you are studying English. Let's take a look at some more examples. The first sentence says, he is watching a movie. We start with the subject and a be verb. In this case, the subject is he. For he, she, and it, we use the be verb is. Then you'll notice I added an ing to the end of the verb watch. He is watching a movie. The next sentence says, Tim is playing a computer game. He's doing that right now. Tim is a he. Therefore, again, we use the be verb is. And again, you'll notice I added ing to the end of the verb. The next sentence says, the machine is making a noise. Now pay attention to the subject, the machine. What is the proper pronoun? The answer is it. Therefore, we use the be verb is. The machine is making a noise. We can also say it is making a noise or the contraction it's making a noise. And finally, Tom and Ben are speaking English. In this case, you'll notice that we use the be verb are. Can you figure out why? That's because Tom and Ben, the subject pronoun for these two is they. They are speaking English. Let's move on to the next usage. The present continuous tense is also used to describe a longer action in progress, even though you might not be doing the action right now. Let's take a look at some examples. The first sentence says, I'm reading an interesting book these days. In this case, the subject is I, so the be verb is am. In this example, we use the contraction I'm by putting I and am together. Again, you'll notice there's an ing after the verb. The next sentence says, you are studying to become an English teacher. The subject here is you. Therefore, the be verb is are. Next, Stephen is preparing for the IELTS exam. The subject here is Stephen, which is a he. Therefore, we use the be verb is. And finally, John and June are working at a company. If you look at the subject John and June, the pronoun for that is they. That's why we use the be verb are. They are working at a company. Let's move on to the next usage. The present continuous is also used to talk about near future plans. Let's take a look. She is meeting some friends tonight. That's going to happen in the near future. You'll notice that we have she, so the be verb is, and then we added an ing to the end of the verb meet. The next example says, we are going on vacation in July. The subject here is we, therefore we use the be verb are. We can also use a contraction and say, we're going on vacation in July. Again, another near future plan. The next example says David is learning to drive tomorrow. Tomorrow is the near future. David is the subject. David is a he, so we use is. And lastly, Vicky and I are teaching English next week. Vicky and I, if we think about the subject pronoun, is we. That's why we used are. We are teaching. Let's move on. Now, let's talk about the negative form of the present continuous tense. I have some examples here. These two examples are for actions that are happening right now or longer actions. These last two are for near future plans. Let's take a look. The first sentence says, I am not having fun. Now, that's not true for me because I am having fun, but in this example, I am not having fun. You'll notice that the word not goes between the be verb and the verb ing. In the second example, it says Jane isn't doing her homework. Here, we use the contraction isn't for is not. So just like the first sentence, we put not between is and verb ing. The next sentence says, you're not seeing him tonight. Here, we have a contraction for you are. You're not seeing him tonight. And finally, we are not running tomorrow morning. Here we have the subject we, Therefore, we use the be verb are. Don't forget to add a not after that to make it negative. Let's move on. Now, let's talk about how to form be verb questions in the present continuous tense. The first example here says, is he waiting for you? Or is he waiting for you? We start with the be verb. Take a look at the subject though. The subject is he, and that's why we start with the be verb is. Is he waiting for you? You can answer, yes, he is, or no, he isn't. The second sentence says, are you coming to class? The subject here is you, and that's why we start with are. Are you coming to class? You can answer, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. The next question says, is he preparing to study in Canada? The subject is he, and so we start with is. The answer can be, yes, he is, or it can also be, no, he isn't. Finally, the last question says, are they going out tonight? The subject here is they, and so we start with are. The answer can be, yes, they are, or no, they aren't. Let's move on. Now, let's talk about the WH question form for the present continuous tense. I have some examples here, and you'll notice that we start with the WH questions. What, where, when, who, why, and how. What comes after? You'll notice it's the be verbs. Are, is, and if the subject is I, am. So, after that, you have the subject, and then the verb ing. Let's take a look at the first sentence. What are you doing? I'm asking about right now. For example, I'm teaching English. Where are you going? I'm going to the store. When is it starting? It's starting at 3. I can be talking about a movie, a show, anything can be it. Who is she talking to? She's talking to Bob. Why is she crying? She's crying because she's sad. And finally, how is it going? It's going well. For this checkup of the present continuous tense, we'll look at how this tense can be used to describe an action that's happening right now. Let's take a look at the first sentence. You blank learning English. Remember, for this tense, we start with the subject and the be verb, and then the verb ing. We already have the verb ing here, so we need the be verb. The subject in the first sentence is you. For you, we, and they, we use the be verb are. So the correct answer is, you are learning English right now. The next sentence says, she blank not watching TV. This is the negative form of the present continuous tense. We have the word not before the verb ing. However, we're missing the be verb again. What is the be verb to use if the subject is she? The correct answer is. She is not watching TV. This one says, I blank studying now. The subject here is I. Again, think of the be verb that goes for the subject I. The be verb is am. I am studying now. We can also use a contraction and say, I'm studying now. If we wanted to turn this into the negative form, we can also say, I'm not studying now. Now, take a look at the next sentence and find the mistake. Layla is watch a movie. Here we have the subject, and the subject pronoun for Layla would be she. We have the correct be verb, is. However, you'll notice we forgot the ing at the end of the verb. We need to say watching. Layla is watching a movie. The next sentence says, they playing soccer now. What's missing? If you got it, the correct answer is we need the be verb are because the subject is they. They are playing soccer now. And finally, what do you do? If you want to ask somebody what they're doing right now, you say what, and the be verb are you doing. What are you doing? Let's move on to the next practice. For this checkup, we'll talk about the present continuous tense and how it can be used to describe an action that started in the past and continues today. It's a longer action. Let's take a look at the first sentence. He blank studying economics. Remember, for this tense, we take the subject, a be verb, and then verb ing. Here, we already have the verb ing, studying. So, what are we missing? The be verb. The correct be verb for the subject he is. So, he is studying economics. The next sentence says they're blank for the fight. The verb we want to use is train. Now, we already have the be verb here. It's in the contraction there because it's they are. All we have to do now is add ing to the verb. They're training for the fight these days. And we blank teaching at the school. Again, we're missing the be verb. What is the be verb for we? The correct answer is are. We are teaching at the school. Now, let's look for the mistakes in the next sentence. Ben is studying to become a doctor. Can you find the error? Well, we have the subject and we have the proper be verb. What we're missing is the ing at the end of study. The correct answer is Ben is studying to become a doctor. Let's look at the next sentence. I don't reading that book. I don't reading that book? To form the negative in the present continuous, we don't use do or does. We use the be verb. What is the be verb for I? The correct answer is am. I am not reading that book. There is no contraction for am not. Finally, they are to learn English. We have the subject and we have the correct be verb, but remember, we need verb ing. Therefore, the correct answer is they are learning English. Let's move on to the next checkup. For this checkup, we'll take a look at how the present continuous tense can be used to talk about future plans. Let's take a look. The first sentence says, they're play a game tonight. The verb we want to use is play. Remember, we start with the subject, and here we have it, they. Then we have the be verb. In this case, we used a contraction for they are, there. That's correct. After that, we have to add ing to the end of the verb. So the correct answer is, they're playing a game tonight. The next sentence says, we blank not studying tomorrow. Looks good, but there's a word that's missing. This is the negative form because we have not. We simply need the be verb for we. The correct be verb is are. We are not studying tomorrow. The next sentence says, Lynn is blank out tonight, and we want to use the verb go. Remember, Lynn and then the be verb is, that's correct. All we have to do is add ing, going. Lynn is going out tonight. To make this negative, you can say Lynn is not going out tonight or Lynn isn't going out tonight. The next sentence says, Laura isn't study this evening. Can you find the mistake? Remember, we have to add ing to the end of the verb. So we need to say, Laura isn't studying this evening. The next sentence says, my sons will playing chess later. We are talking about a future plan, so you might be tempted to use will. However, instead of saying will, we use the be verb. My sons are playing chess later. And finally, she's not eating dinner tonight. There's an extra word in here that we don't need. What is it? It's to. Remember, subject, be verb, not, verb, ing. We do not need to in this sentence. All right, well, that's the end of this checkup. Let's move on. Good job, everyone. You just completed the lesson on the present continuous tense. This tense is not easy, but you did a great job and keep watching to learn more. I know English can be difficult, but with practice and effort, you will improve, I promise. See you in the next video. Hi everyone, I'm Esther. In this video, I'm going to introduce the present perfect tense. This tense can be used to talk about an action that happened in the past, but when it happened is not very important or it's unknown. It can also be used to talk about an action that started in the past and continues in the present. We really want to emphasize how long the action has been happening. And finally, we use this tense to talk about a recent action. There's a lot to learn and a lot of important information, so keep watching. Let's talk about one usage of the present perfect tense. This tense can be used to talk about an action that happened in the past, but when it happened is not important or not known. However, this action is important to the conversation right now. Let's take a look at some examples. The first one says, I have been to Canada. What we do here is we start with the subject, I. For I, you, we, and they, we follow with have. After that, we use the past participle of the verb. In this case, the verb is be, and so the past participle is been. I have been to Canada. The next sentence says, my cousins have seen the movie. My cousins is a they, and so again, we follow with have. And the past participle of see is seen. They have seen the movie, or my cousins have seen the movie. The next example says, Chad has gone home. Chad is a he. For he, she, it, we follow with has. Then the past participle gone is for the verb go. Chad has gone home. And finally, my phone has been fixed. My phone is an it. Therefore, I use has. And then I need the past participle of be, been. My phone has been fixed. Let's move on to the next usage. The present perfect tense is also used to describe an action that started in the past and continues in the present. For and since are common expressions used with the present perfect tense. Let's take a look at these examples. I have worked there since 2002. You'll notice we start with the subject. If it's I, you, or we have. Then the past participle of the verb, in this case, worked. What you'll notice here is that we also have since 2002. This shows when the action started. So with the expression since, you need to use a specific point in time. The next example does the same thing. You have had a car since last year. Again, we use since, so we have a specific point in time, last year. Take a look at the next example. Anna has liked him for weeks. In this case, the subject is Anna, which is a she, and so we use has, then the past participle liked. However, at the end of this sentence, we see for weeks, not since weeks. When we use for, we talk about the duration. We explain how long this action has been true. And finally, we have eaten lunch here for 3 months. Again, the sentence ends with for 3 months, so we show the duration. Let's move on to the next usage. In addition, the present perfect tense can be used to describe an action that recently stopped. Let's take a look at some examples. I have just been to the doctor. So just like for all the other usages, we start with the subject, have or has, and the past participle. But you'll notice here I use the word just between have and the verb. I have just been to the doctor. This shows that it happened very recently. The next example says, James has just seen his new baby. Again, just goes in between have or has and the verb. Take a look at the next example. It says, she has already been to China. Already is another word you can use to show that this action recently happened. However, already can also be moved to the end of the sentence. So it's perfectly fine to say, she has been to China already. And in the last example, we have recently visited Tom. Again, you can put this word between have or has and the verb, or you can also put it at the end of the sentence. We have visited Tom recently. Let's move on. Let's take a look at the negative form of the present perfect tense. Here are some examples. The first one says, I have not been to Europe. What you'll notice in the first sentence is that we simply put a not between have and been. I have not been to Europe. You can also use a contraction and say, I haven't been to Europe. The next sentence says, it has not rained for 3 months. Again, we put the not between the has and the verb. It has not rained for 3 months. Here, we have a time expression to show the duration. The next example says, Teddy hasn't driven for 2 years. We use the contraction here for has and not, hasn't. And then we use the time expression for 2 years at the end of the sentence. And finally, the last sentence says, my sons haven't played soccer since 2010. We see another contraction here for have not, haven't. My sons haven't played soccer since 2010. This time expression uses since, and so we mention a specific point in time. Let's move on. Now, let's take a look at the have or has question form for the present perfect tense. Take a look at the board. The first sentence says, Mike has eaten lunch. That is a statement. Now to turn it into a question, it's quite easy. All you have to do is put has at the beginning. Then you follow with the subject and then the past participle. You'll notice that the placement of the past participle doesn't change. We've simply changed the order of the first 2 words. Has Mike eaten lunch? Has Mike eaten lunch? And you can answer by saying, yes, he has, or no, he hasn't. The next sentence says, they have watched the video. This is a statement. If we want to turn it into a question, again, we change the order of the first 2 words. Have they? And the past participle verb stays in the same place. Have they watched the video? Have they watched the video? You can answer this question by saying, yes, they have, or no, they haven't. Good job, guys. Let's move on. Now, I'll briefly introduce how to ask WH questions in the present perfect tense. Take a look at the board. I have where, what, who, and how. These go at the beginning of the question. Let's take a look at the first example. Where has Tim been? You'll notice we follow the WH word with has or have. In this case, I use has because the subject is Tim, and Tim is a he. And then we followed that with the past participle of the verb. Where has Tim been? And I can answer by saying Tim has been home, or Tim has been on vacation, something like that. The next question says, what countries have you visited? I can answer by saying, I have visited China, or I have visited Mexico. You can also use the contraction I've visited China. The next question says, who has she talked to? You can answer by saying, she has talked to her mom, or she has talked to her teacher. The next question says, how long have you been married? I've been married for 3 years. That's one answer that you can give. Great job, everybody. Let's move on. For this checkup, we'll take a look at the present perfect tense, which describes an action that happened at an unknown or indefinite time in the past. Let's look at the first sentence. She blank read that book. The subject in this sentence is she. For he, she, it, in this tense, we say has. She has. Now, take a look at the verb. It looks like read, but remember, we need to use the past participle of the verb, so it's actually read. Read and read are spelled the same. She has read that book. The second sentence says, they blank visit China. Visit is the verb that you want to use here. For I, you, we, and they, we use have, not has. They have. Now, what's the past participle of visit? The answer is visited. They have visited China. Next, we blank see that concert. Again, for I, you, we, and they, we use have. We have. Now, the past participle of see is seen. We have seen that concert. Now, let's look for the mistake in the next sentence. Rick have been to Cuba. Take a look at the subject. Rick. Rick is a he. So, instead of have, we need to change this to has. Rick has been to Cuba. Sally and I hasn't finished work. The subject in this sentence is Sally and I. The pronoun for that is we. We hasn't finished work? That still sounds weird, right? We have to change this to have not, or the contraction haven't. And finally, I did go to the doctor. Now this sentence makes sense, but it's not the present perfect tense. We have to change it. Remember, we use have for the subject I. But we're not done. What is the past participle of go? It is gone. I have gone to the doctor. Great job. Let's move on to the next checkup. In this checkup, we'll talk about the present perfect tense and how it can be used to describe an action that started in the past and is still true today. The first sentence says, I blank known Carly since 1994. The subject is I, and we already have the past participle of the verb know, which is known. What are we missing? The correct answer is have. For I, you, we, and they, we use have after the subject. The next sentence says, he has been here blank 2 p.m. Now, the first part is all there. He has been. However, remember that for the present perfect tense, we use for or since to talk about how long that action has been true. In this case, we use since because 2 p.m. is a specific period in time. Next, it says she blank liked Tom since June. The subject is she, and we have the past participle of the verb like, which is liked. What are we missing? Again, we need have or has. Because the subject is she, can you figure out which one you need? The correct answer is has. She has liked Tom since June. Now, I want you to find the mistake in the next sentence. I have worked here 6 months ago. Can you find the mistake here? I have worked. That's correct. However, in the present perfect tense, we don't use ago. This is talking about more the past. We want to talk about since or for instead. Now, 6 months is not a specific time, so we don't use since. Instead, we talk about the duration, so we need for. We'll say, I have worked here for 6 months. Let's take a look at the next sentence. Jen have a cold for 2 weeks. At first glance, this doesn't seem that wrong, but remember, Jen is a she, so we need has. Jen has. But wait a minute, Jen has have a cold? That's not right either. We need the past participle of have. What is the past participle? The correct answer is had. Jen has had a cold for 2 weeks. And finally, we haven't went home since Friday. This one is a little tricky. The subject is we. We have not. That's correct. The contraction is haven't. We haven't. Now, the problem is we have this verb went. That's in the past simple tense. We need the past participle of go. The correct answer is gone. We haven't gone home since Friday. Good job, guys. Let's move on to the next checkup. In this checkup, we'll take a look at the present perfect tense and how it is used to describe an action that finished recently. We'll be focusing on the words just, already, and recently to show this. Let's take a look at the first sentence. She has just blank that book, and we're using the verb read. Remember, we take the subject she, and for he, she, and it, we say has. So that's correct. Now we need the past participle of read, and that is read. She has just read that book. You'll notice I use the word just right before the past participle. Next, it says they have already, and the verb is wake up. If the subject is he, she, or it, we use has. But if the subject is I, you, we, or they, we use have. So that's correct. They have. Also, we have the word already here to show that it happened recently or that it finished recently. Now the verb is wake up. We need the past participle of wake up, and that is woken up. So the answer is they have already woken up. The next sentence says, we have recently blank work, and the verb is finish. We have, that's correct, and we have the word recently to show when the action finished. And now we need to find the past participle of the verb finish. The correct answer is we have recently finished ed work. Now, try to find the mistake in the next sentence. Morty has eaten just. This sounds a little strange, right? That's because just needs to come before the verb. Therefore, the answer is Morty has just eaten. The next sentence says, Karen has recently been sick. Karen is a she, so has is correct. And there we have recently. Now we need the past participle of the verb. Be is our verb and the past participle of be is been. Karen has recently been sick. And finally, I have gone already to the dentist. This is similar to another question we looked at just before. I have gone already to the dentist. The placement of already is a little awkward. So we can say, I have already gone. So we can put already before the verb, I have already gone to the dentist. Or we can put this at the end. I have gone to the dentist already. Both of those are correct. Now, good job. That is the end of the checkup. Let's move on. Excellent job, everyone. You just learned about the present perfect tense. There was a lot to learn, but you did a wonderful job. Keep studying English. I know that it's hard, but you will get better with time, effort, and practice. I'll see you in the next video. Hi everyone, welcome to the video. In this video, I will introduce the present perfect continuous English tense. This tense can be used to talk about an action that started in the past and continues in the present. It can also be used to talk about an action that has been happening recently. And finally, it can also be used to talk about an action that recently stopped. There's a lot to learn, so keep watching. You can use the present perfect continuous tense to talk about an action that started in the past and continues in the present. We want to emphasize duration, and you can do that by using for or since in your sentence. Let's take a look at some examples. Charles has been studying English for an hour. Take a look at the subject, Charles. The subject pronoun for Charles is he, and that's why we say has. After that, we add been and then verb ing. In this case, studying. You'll also notice that at the end of the sentence, we have for an hour. That shows how long this action has been happening. When you use for, you emphasize the duration, for an hour. Charles has been studying English for an hour. Let's take a look at the next sentence. Lily has been playing the piano for 2 years. In this case, Lily is a she. And that's why, again, we say has. You'll notice again we have been and then verb ing. In this case, playing. At the end of this sentence, we also used for and then 2 years. So again, we're showing how long this has been happening. The next sentence is a little different. It has been growing since June. So it can be something like a plant. The plant, or it, has been growing since June. Here, we used since, not for. What's the difference? We use a specific point in time with since. We don't say since 2 hours. No, we say when the action started, since June. And finally, Dan and I have been working since 6 a.m. The subject pronoun for Dan and I is we. Therefore, we use have. At the end of this sentence, we have since 6 a.m. Remember that with since, we talk about a specific point in time when the action started. Let's move on. The present perfect continuous can also be used without emphasizing duration. In this case, we mean lately. This action has been happening lately. And so we can use the words lately or recently to explain this. Let's take a look at some examples. You have been missing many classes lately. You'll notice that at the end of this sentence, I use the word lately to describe when this action has been happening. You can also use lately at the beginning of the sentence. For example, lately, you have been missing many classes. The next example says, recently, Toby has been running every day. In this sentence, we used recently at the beginning to show when this action has been happening. You can also use recently at the end of the sentence. Toby has been running every day recently. In this example, the subject is Toby, and so we use has after Toby because Toby is a he. The next example says, lately, Dana has been swimming a lot. Again, we use lately at the beginning of this sentence, but you can also use it at the end. Dana is a she, and so we follow this subject with has. And finally, we've been practicing English together recently. We is the subject of this sentence, and so we use have. Here, we use the contraction we've. We have becomes we've. We've been practicing English together recently. We can put recently at the end, or we can say recently, we've been practicing English together. Let's move on. The present perfect continuous tense can also be used to talk about an action that recently stopped and has a present result. Let's take a look at the examples. I'm tired because I have been running. The second part of the sentence, I have been running, is using the present perfect continuous tense. This is the action that recently stopped. And as a result, I'm tired. This is the present result. What's happening now because of this? I'm tired. The next example says, the street is wet because it has been raining. This is very similar to the first sentence. Here, we know that it has been raining, and this action recently stopped. As a result, in the present, the street is wet. The street is wet right now because of this action. The next example says, you don't understand because you haven't been listening. You'll notice here that we use the negative. Here's the contraction haven't for have not. Because of this action, you haven't been listening. Now, you don't understand. In the last example, we switched the order a little bit. I've been studying all night. There is the present perfect continuous tense. This is the action that stopped recently. And here's the result. Now, I'm exhausted. Great job, everyone. Let's move on. Let's take a look at the negative form of the present perfect continuous tense. Here are some examples. I have not been feeling well these days. At the end of the sentence, we have these days to show that this is an action that's been happening recently. In the negative form, we have to have a not. The not goes after have or has. In this case, the subject is I, so I used have. I have not been feeling well these days. We can also use a contraction haven't for have not. I haven't been feeling well these days. The next sentence says, Sue has not been cooking lately. We have lately at the end of this sentence. We can also put lately at the beginning of this sentence. The important part of this sentence is to put not after has. Why did we use has? Because the subject is Sue, which is a she. For he, she, it, we use has. Again, we can use a contraction hasn't for has not. Sue hasn't been cooking lately. The next sentence says, Jeff hasn't been eating healthy food recently. Again, the recently can be used at the beginning or end of this sentence. We have the contraction hasn't here for you. Hasn't is a contraction for has not. We have has because the subject is Jeff, which is a he. And finally, they haven't been speaking for over a year. In this case, for over a year shows duration. Remember, with for, you show how long something has been happening. In this case, we have a contraction haven't for have not. Great job, everybody. Let's move on. Now, let's take a look at how to form the have or has question for the present perfect continuous tense. The first sentence says, he has been reading for an hour. Now, to turn this into a question, all we have to do is change the order of the first two words. So he has becomes has he. Has he been reading for an hour? You'll notice that the second part of the sentence doesn't change. Has he been reading for an hour? To answer, you can simply say, yes, he has, or no, he hasn't. The next sentence says, they have been sleeping since 8 p.m. Again, the second part of the sentence stays the same, and in the beginning, we just switch the first two words. They have becomes have they. Have they been sleeping since 8 p.m.? To answer, you can say, yes, they have, or no, they haven't. Great job, everybody. Let's move on. Now, let's take a look at how to form WH questions in the present perfect continuous tense. Here, we have some WH question words. What, where, why, and how. Let's take a look at the first question. What have you been doing lately? I can answer by saying, I have been working, or I have been studying. I can also use the contraction I've been working. I've been studying. The next question says, where have you been traveling? I have been traveling in Europe, or I've been traveling in Europe. Why has he been feeling sad? You can answer by saying, he's been feeling sad. That's the contraction he has. He's been feeling sad because his pet died. Or he has been feeling sad because he broke up with his girlfriend, something like that. And how has she been doing? How has she been doing? I can say she's been doing well. She's is a contraction for she has. Great job, everyone. Let's move on. In this checkup, we will talk about the present perfect continuous tense. This tense can be used to describe an event that started in the past and continues in the present. Let's take a look. The first sentence says, he has blank all week, and the verb is sleep. For this tense, what we do is we first look at the subject, he. For he, she, and it, we put has. Then we add been, has been. Finally, we add ing to the end. He has been sleeping all week. The next sentence says, you haven't blank for a year, and the verb is travel. Now, this is the negative form, so you see the contraction haven't. You have not, or you haven't. Again, what we do after that is add been. Then, do you remember what to do? Add ing to the verb. You haven't been traveling for a year. Next, it says they blank working all day. So the verb ing has already been provided for you. Now, take a look at the subject. The subject is they. Should we use have or should we use has? The correct answer is have. Then what do you put? Remember, we put been. They have been working all day. Now, if you want to make this negative, you can say they haven't been working all day. Now, find the mistake in the next sentence. My friends have been watch TV. My friends have been watch TV. What's the mistake? Remember, we need to add ing to the end of the verb. So, we should say, my friends have been watching TV. Next, Sal did talking for 10 minutes. Sal is a he, and talking is already there for you. So what's in the middle of those two words is the mistake. For he, we use has. So we say has been. Sal has been talking for 10 minutes. And finally, he has been to eat for an hour. He has been. That's correct. However, in this sentence, the base form of the verb eat was used. Instead, remember we need ing. This is the correct answer. He has been eating for an hour. All right, good job, and let's move on to the next practice. In this practice, we'll take a look at the present perfect continuous tense and see how it expresses an action that has been happening recently or lately. Let's take a look at the first sentence. She has blank bad lately, and the verb is feel. Remember, for she, we use has. Then, don't forget, we need to have been. She has been. After that, we add ing to the verb. The correct sentence is, she has been feeling bad lately. The next sentence says, we haven't blank much recently, and the verb is cook. This is a negative sentence, so we say we have not, or the contraction haven't. We haven't, don't forget, been, and then verb ing. We haven't been cooking much recently. Finally, we move on. Let's try to find the mistake. We has been riding bikes to school recently. What's the mistake in this sentence? The subject here is we. For I, you, we, and they, we have to say have been, not has been. We have been riding bikes to school recently. And for the last one, Jenny lately hasn't been helping me. The lately is placed wrong in this sentence. We have to say, lately, Jenny hasn't been helping me. Or we can also say, Jenny hasn't been helping me lately. Let's move on to the next checkup. In this checkup, we'll talk about the present perfect continuous tense and how it expresses an action that stopped recently but has a present result. The first sentence says, I blink. That's why I'm so sweaty. The verb here is exercise, and the subject is I. Do we use has or have for the subject I? The correct answer is have. Then we put been and then verb ing. Okay, so the correct answer is I have been exercising. That's why I'm so sweaty. That's the result. The next sentence says, I'm covered in flour because I blank. And the verb is bake. Take a look. I'm covered in flour because. So this first part is the result. I need to show the action that stopped recently in the present perfect continuous tense. Again, the subject is I, so we use have been. Then, all we do is add ing to the end of baking. I have been baking. So again, I'm covered in flour because I have been baking. And we can use the contraction and say, I've been baking. Now, find the mistake in the next sentence. She has think a lot, so she has a headache. Take a look. The result is that she has a headache. So we need to use the present perfect continuous for the first part. She has is correct. What's missing? Don't forget the been. Also, don't forget that we need to add ing to the verb. She has been thinking a lot, so she has a headache. Look at the next sentence and find the mistake. I'm so hungry because I have been diet. The only mistake here is that someone forgot to put the ing at the end of the verb diet. The correct answer is, I'm so hungry because I have been dieting. Great job, everyone. Let's move on. Thank you so much for watching this grammar course on the present tense. Now, I want you to watch the next grammar course on the past tense. I'll see you there.